Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tech Central. Very, very warm welcome to today's webinar. We're thrilled to have Mike Mason on the call today. Mike Mason is the Regional Director of Varonis. And Varonis, very importantly, is able to give us an understanding and an explanation as to why and how so often our data, our highly valuable and sensitive data, is often exposed and we don't know it. Now, not to point any fingers or identify one problem or another, but really to identify that if that data is not accurately managed and the settings and the toggles, I suppose one could say, in the background, we don't really know where our data is, who's got access to it, and why the people that we think should have trusted access to it are not necessarily using it in the right place and in the right way. So, Mike, thank you very, very much for joining us. We really look forward to this call. And I know that our listeners are very much looking forward to understanding more about what Varonis does and how it does it, but also using some really practical case studies and listening to those examples and how it might be relevant to their own businesses. So thank you, Mike.
Yeah, James, pleasure to be here. And thanks for having us. Really excited for the topic, managing your data and understanding where your data is in your environments. We've been helping customers since 2005. Managing and protecting their data. So really look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Mike. And you've used Salesforce, and it's a CRM system that we all know and love so well. It's the largest CMS system in the world that's currently managing relationships and sales and commerce and all sorts of IT services, and relates in the back end to something that could possibly be where data is stored and used very effectively, but possibly at risk.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit here, James. Like your CRM, right? Salesforce is a leader in this category by a long shot, right? They're selling over $20 billion of software a year across the world. And think about this for one moment, right? Typically, your CRM is usually purchased by a business unit, right? Because it's cloud-based. It doesn't need any IT help. You can just spin it up, give them your credit card, and off you go, using the CRM of choice. And what we've seen over time, James, is that this CRM becomes mission critical to your organization. It handles many different facets and organizations of your business. It typically starts off as your typical database for your prospects and customers, but it quickly morphs into doing contracts, doing knowledge-based articles, hosting a whole portal for your customers. And in the slide deck and the information that we provided for you, slide 6 really hones in on this, James, on how interconnected your CRM system could be across your organization. And what typically we see, James, is that this is governed by the business apps team, and it doesn't have oversight from security or IT, right? Because I want to put this out here too, is these SaaS providers such as Salesforce, such as AWS, they spend a ton of money on securing the infrastructure because they own these cloud repositories. But they give you unlimited amount of capabilities to configure. And it's this shared responsibility model that you need to understand when you're using SaaS applications. And to really put it very simply, is that once you put data inside of a SaaS application, it becomes your responsibility to protect it.
Okay, thank you. And to our listeners, we're going to share some slides after this webinar with you and make them absolutely available to you. And what Mike's referring to is a very detailed web of all the applications that can connect to, by means of an example, Salesforce. And Salesforce have a mantra where they refer to customer 360. And I think that is a useful analogy to look at the 360 degrees around which the product is used, but also around which the customer is exposed. And keeping the customer happy is one thing. That's Salesforce's prerogative. And that's what they try their best to do. But their relationship in your organization isn't necessarily through your head of security or your chief information officer or chief intelligence officer. And maybe it was originally, and this is what you touched on, Mike, acquired by the business for the purpose of sales. And all of a sudden, all of your customers, all of your 360 data is now sitting possibly exposed.
Yeah. And It's funny that you say that, because when you purchase CRM, it's really to increase the velocity of your business, right? You need all that 360 information together in one spot so you can do meaningful, impactful business for your customers, right? Because at the end of the day, James, this is all about our customers, right? We want to provide them services based on their profile, based on their purchase history. You want to provide the best service possible so they become a recurring customer, right? So when you put all this data inside of Salesforce, it serves you as a business, but also the thing that you got to think about, all this data on your customers are in one spot, right? And if that data was to be leaked, what would happen? Would your brand be ruined? Would you lose customers? Would you lose incremental revenue because you lost the trust of your customers because they gave you information about them, that entrusting that you're going to keep that data safe so you can do business together? And if that data goes away and gets in the wrong hands, do you lose that trust?
Definitely.
Those are things that you need to ask yourself. And I would even challenge, James, the listeners on this call, do you even know what's inside of your CRM?
Yeah, good point. Good question. Give that some thought. As a listener, go back and interrogate what is in your CRM. What level of security are you expected to have over that individual's data? We all understand GDPR and POPIA and other different implications on how we store our data. But remember, you can have the fanciest castle, but unless you have the protection and security, a lot of your data could leak from within.
Yeah, because James, as we talked about this, right, and I gave you an analogy, right, is you don't really rob a bank to steal the pens, right? Someone doesn't break into your system to steal, to see what's going on. They want your data. And if you don't know where your data is, how are you going to be able to protect it? Because now with the SaaS environments, the perimeter goes away. We spend a lot of time, a lot of effort protecting the perimeter, making sure people can't get into our systems, which is a necessary thing to do. But if you had the keys to my home, along with the security code, your password, let's say, you can walk through the front door, James, but would I know what you took from my home?
Not until it was too late.
I know what's in my home, right? I think I know what's in my home, but I would have no clue if you took my Rolex watch out. Well, first of all, I would have to have one, but let's just pretend, right? If you took a Rolex watch out of my dresser, until I went to go put it on, I would have no idea.
Sure. And this ties very closely with cybersecurity, obviously. But what we're also talking about here is why possibly Salesforce as a software provider is so difficult to set up. Why it's so difficult to have the security settings correct or appropriate, if that's a better word. What are some of your experiences there, Mike?
Yeah, Salesforce is a great tool, and it gives you a lot of flexibility. With a lot of that flexibility comes a lot of different ways that you can set this up. And we go through this very in detail in the supplemental documents or the PowerPoint that you can have. And it really starts on slide 11. And really, James, what Salesforce does in the shared responsibility model, they give you the ability to configure the way that you want your configuration to happen. So let's take, for an example, if I'm they all have a profile. Salesforce, if you're going to be a user, you have to have a profile. And a profile gives you the basic necessities of what you can do inside of Salesforce. But then in that profile, there's also permission sets, which are additive, which means that you can do extra things inside of Salesforce. And then you're governed also under a role. So if I was a regional director, I can see all of my team's data underneath them. But if I was the CEO, I could see the whole company's data, right? And they give you all these different controls that you can configure, highly configure this, but it's up to you to make sure that the right people have the right access to the data. And in each one of these settings, James, and I go a little into the weeds here, there's over 250 different settings. From, do you want to manage users? Can you manage profiles? Can you export data? Can you view all data? Can you manage your portal. Those are so minute, granular details. And it's an absolute nightmare to try to manage these at scale across your organization. And it gets down to that. How do you set up for least privilege?
And I'm somewhat aware of different platforms that I've been exposed to. One example I'm just thinking of right now is Google Workspace. A similar structure. You've got to be very aware of your organizational structure, your org design, the levels of security and permissions you can give. And that configuration is subject to misconfiguration.
It absolutely is, because, James, as you talked about Google, there's 4 different layers here, right? And on slide 20, I think it sets it up really well, right? There's a whole org level setting. So your whole org, your whole CRM, there's a level of setting for the user on how a user is going to get access. And then there's a record level setting, and that the records are really around your data, right? And then inside of Salesforce, you actually have fields. So you can go down to the actual field and have field level settings too. And this, don't be scared on this, guys. This is common inside of the SaaS applications. We're focused on Salesforce here today, but there are many different SaaS apps that are set up like this, whether it's AWS, whether it's GCP. They give you this type of configuration. And it's not that we don't want to scare you, but we want to just inform that there's all these different possibilities, and that there are tools out there that can help you scale this and help you understand what people have access to and actually what's inside your environment, right? Because you can set all these different settings, James, that we talked about, but at the end of the day, it goes down to the data. It always comes back to the data on what you want your users to see based on their job role within your organization.
So, Mike, we've talked a lot about cloud-based applications, Salesforce being one. How different is this to on-prem? And could you perhaps give us an example of an incident?
Yeah, it's very similar to on-prem, right? Because you have groups, you have the same thing, right? Inside of your on-prem environment. But now it's just really just shifted to the cloud. So don't think of this as a whole new learning curve. You already know this, right? It's just with different terminology. And so I'll give you an example, right? And it could be, I was working with a large financial service firm, right? They were using Salesforce, and the business as a whole wanted to process mortgages a lot quicker. So they built an app that you just go on your phone and you download the app and you put in your name, your address, what property you want to buy, along with all your banking information, along with your personal identification, along with all your tax information. And when you put that inside of the app, all that data, when you hit submit button, it went into Salesforce. So when we went into a Salesforce environment for this financial firm and we showed exactly what data was in there, the IT team had no idea that this data was being resided inside of Salesforce. But then we were able to show them who had access to this, because we broke down all of these permissionings, all of these profiles, and we were able to actually tell them exactly who had access and why.
And there must have been some pretty unique anomalies. I've heard of shadow instances.
Yes. So because SaaS is so easy to spin up and spin down, that when we were working with this financial institution, when we went over to the business apps team, the Salesforce team or the business apps team, they had 5 to 10 different instances of Salesforce that each division was using independently and keeping data in there. And the IT team had no idea. So when we bridged that gap to IT and security with the business app team, it goes to show how quick the velocity of your SaaS applications can be. But in those shadow instances, they had production data, because to clone an environment, it's just a click of a button, James, on the back end to say clone, and then you're usually doing some testing or things like that, right? That's how easy it is in the SaaS world.
That's a huge risk. And just a mere fact, and I smile because you say that the different divisions of the same company using different versions of the same software. That rings so true when you call your service provider and they ask you the same questions that you're sure you've given, you would have to supply that information to them before, but they're still asking for it again. because they're trying to update your profile in 6 or multiple different places. It makes no sense to the customer satisfaction logic.
No, it makes no sense. And I'm going to throw a little quiz at you, right? In these SaaS applications, because they're so readily available. What do you think the average number of SaaS applications exists in one business?
A business size, let's say, of 10,000 employees.
10,000 employees, 500 employees, the average.
8.
110. So if you think that it's just one application, it's many, right? There is, depending on what report that you read, there's on average, there's 110 different SaaS applications in an organization.
Okay, so let's touch on that, because I was vastly wrong. So whatever you say from now on, you will be the person who's right, and I will not. How does Varonis plug in, gather its data from more than one application?
That's a great question, right? And we're a SaaS-based application as well. So what we do is we make this as seamless as possible for you and the end user, is that we plug in via API. And it really takes about 15 minutes to set up each application. So if you want to set up Salesforce, it's 15 minutes. AWS is about 15 minutes. We've honed it down to just doing the API. And what will happen is when we install this API connection, it basically what it's doing is giving us the authority to pull down your event data or your audit log data. And then what we'll do is we will put it in common event language. We will correlate all that information across your Salesforce, across your AWS, across your Google, across your Box, and we will put it into common event language where you can understand, here is James, this is where he logged in, this is the IP, this is the location, this is what he did in Salesforce, this is what he did in AWS. And we're going to put that all together in one single platform so you can get visibility and control on where your data is, understanding where your data is across these applications, who has access to that data and why, along with what they're doing with that data across these different platforms. Okay,
got it. Now, you talk about the user. What about the actual data? Do you obfuscate it? Do you have access to the actual organization's data? And I'm asking that on behalf of our listeners. Or is it just the user's engagement with the said data repositories?
What we do with our classification when we go in, James, we do a scan of that data and we do it right in memory. So we're not moving data over into our platform because now you'll have data sprawl, right? So we want to make sure that your data stays with your platform. And so what we'll do is we will scan that data and we will tag it and put some tags on it because we know that it has a certain type of GDPR data, right? Because it has the name, certain types of configurations. And then we will tag that and we'll bring that over in our environment. And in addition, we can also do some OCR scanning of images as well. Okay. So if you have, passports in there as well, we're going to be able to identify those. And so that's what we're really doing is we don't want to have data sprawl. So we're going to do, like I said, we're going to scan this all in memory and we're going to bring over that metadata into our environment. So then you can get a good view of what's available or what's in your SaaS repositories, such as Salesforce.
Okay, thanks. You say a good view. Is that a dashboard I look at in a live environment? What does it look like for me as the CIO?
As CIO, yes. And in the documents that starts on page 33, we walk you through a scenario as a CIO on how easy it is that you can get this information, because a simple question as a CIO is data subject request comes in, James, right? Who's accessed my data? I know I provided you some data. I want to understand who's accessed my data and the data hasn't been leaked. So you got to be able to answer that question in a reasonable amount of time. So we give you the ability to look at it from a user perspective and also a data perspective. You can actually go to that file and say, who's accessed this file? And you can also look at it from a user perspective because there's many different times. And let's be honest, James, in sales or in your organization, people don't stay there forever, unfortunately, these days. They go from one organization to another. So in offboarding, when you're offboarding an employee, puts in their 2-week notice or whatever, you want to ensure that your data from your SaaS applications are not leaving with them to go to a competitor. So you want to do an offboarding analysis and understanding what they've accessed before they left. Maybe it's 2 weeks before, maybe it's a month, maybe it's 6 months. You want to do that? We're able to provide you all of that information on what that user did, and also what was his actual exposure to your data in your environment.
But Mike, could we chat about being a bit more proactive? What are some of the threat detection measures you might throw up?
So some of the threat detection measures that we throw up inside of our environment that I've seen our customers using is around UEBA, user entity behavioral analytics. And basically what we're going to do is, because we're looking at the user, we understand what normal is. So then we can proactively alert you on abnormal. So this could be an insider threat. This could be some ransomware that has broken into your environment and they start acting and accessing your environment because they have the keys, they have the password and username, and we're looking at that. So then once we understand what normal is, we can detect you on abnormal. And so then therefore, what I like to tell our customers is that we're always working for you in the background. You don't have to be eyes on screen all day, every day, looking for that anomaly. We're going to be in the background looking for these, processing all this data, this audit log data, so then we can actually proactively move you from reactive to proactive. And so then you can get these alerts, these proactive alerts, when something abnormal is occurring in your environment.
Yeah, brilliant. Because that's what we're looking for. We're looking to avoid the rework.
Yeah. You don't want to do that rework. You don't want to go through parsing through log files. Let us do that for you. Yeah. And then also too, James, is when you have compliance regulations and you have to have evidence-based controls of what changed, who got added to your environment. You can just pull that data, because all that data is going to be there, because it's all activity driven on your SaaS application, because we're connected in, looking at the audit log files. All that data is there for you to sort or pull reports against. So instead of you going through and using a VLOOKUP table in Excel, dumping these in a CSV and doing all this manually, which is time and effort, because I'm sure your time is valuable, you could be doing something else. Let us do it and report on it. So then you just a point and click. You want to report, select the date range, select the user, go, and there are the results within 30 seconds.
Mike, you've got a broad range of different customers, and I know that you represent some very interesting and dynamic organizations. Could you give us some examples and tell us how you manage their privacy and compliance?
Yeah, we got a wide spectrum across many different verticals, as you talked about, right? And, a law firm. We have a law firm. Think about all the mergers and acquisition data that they go through, right? They're highly specified in mergers and acquisitions. And all that data, if that data was to be leaked out to the public before that merger and acquisition, that would ruin that law firm's reputation. So that's just an example. We have healthcare companies, we have financial service companies. But what it really comes down to is that these customers of ours value their data. They understand the worth of their data and how important it is to their organization and how important it is to protect the brand and reputation of their organization. So we see in highly regulated industries, because they're kind of mandated a little bit, but also the other industries, whether it be retail, whether it be law firm, whether it be high tech, they understand the value of their data.
I think I saw on your website, military, universities, all sorts of other, very detailed organizations which are data rich, but also very, very sensitive data.
Very sensitive data, yes. And that's where I'll pose that question, James. Do you know where your sensitive data is in your organization? As you go from on-prem to now adopting this SaaS, this digital transformation, as you go into the cloud, ask yourself, do you really know where your sensitive data is? And if you don't, should you know?
Absolutely. So I'm reading some notes I've written here, and one of the things I wrote was the complexity of Salesforce hides unmitigated risk. Now, I know we've talked about this, but you're bringing about some simplicity into something that is highly complex. You're bringing those actionable insights. The real question is, and this is your point about do we know where our data is? Do we know where it is, but also do we know what's happening with it? Do we know who has access to it? And I'm loving what you've exposed me to, because data is so important to all of us, but understanding the data and understanding how data is used is far more important than just collecting it. It's worthless unless you use it for something. What are some of the other questions our listeners should be asking you that we haven't perhaps spoken about yet?
Yeah, and that's a great question, James. I'm going to boil this down to 3 questions for the listeners here, right? The first question that we've already talked about is where your sensitive data is, right? That is a fundamental piece when you talk about data protection, data security. There's 3 different dimensions. Where is your sensitive data? That's the first dimension. The second dimension is, do you know who has access to that data and why? There's a big thing is, okay, you can tell access, but do you know why they have access? Is it, in Google, is it an anybody link, right? Anybody internally inside of Google workspace, right? You can share this internally, and that means anybody inside of your organization could have that access to that information. So the question is, do you know who has access to that data and why, right? So that's the second question. The third question that you should ask yourself is, do you know what your users are doing with that data? Do you understand where they're logging in from, when they're logging in, what they're accessing once they gain access, what they're accessing, what they're updating, what they're deleting, what they're reading inside of your environment, right? Because, James, we talk about all these insider threats, right? If you look at the IBM breach report, insider threats continue to increase over time on these threat vectors. And you need to understand, that's why you need to understand what are people accessing in your environment, because there are times, I know in healthcare facilities, we call low and slow attacks, where they don't dump a big data dump of data. They systematically go through record after record looking for certain information. And over time, they statistically access more data than their peers.
Okay. Mike, this has been fascinating. I'm reassured that if my data needed to be secure and I needed to understand the difference between and that shared responsibility you talked about, I need to understand what is the responsibility of my software service provider, what are they doing for me, and what are they not doing? Because it's what they're not doing that you cover. And it's guiding me to understand how to use a platform better.
It's absolutely on what they're not doing, because they give you the controls to do it, but it's up to you to set it up, right? So you need to understand that as you make this digital transformation, you need to understand that. And we're here to help you, because we see so many different facets across the globe on different configurations. We're here to help. So just, feel free to reach out, and we'll be happy to help you understand these 3 different dimensions of data and help you understand what best practices are to ensure that your security posture is in line with your business.
Brilliant. And Mike, I think on that note, you summed it up beautifully. We've had a fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot from it, and I know our listeners will too. We'll make your white papers and your website and the presentation you've been referring to available to our listeners. And as you rightly say, any questions, any comments, any suggestions, we're open to receiving. And we at Tech Central are huge supporters of using technology to enable our businesses, but using it in the right way. And if we don't know what the right way is, we look to Varonis and organizations like yourselves to really guide us and help us make best use of technology. So, Mike Mason, thank you very, very much. For me, James Rasmus at Tech Central, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, James. Thanks for having us. It's always great to connect with you, and look forward to educating your listeners further.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.